She thought it was the worst day of her life. She was wrong. It was only just beginning. The rope wasn't just tight, it was a living thing, a serpent of fire chewing through the skin of her wrists. Every jolt of the horse ahead was a bolt of lightning, shooting up her arms, trying to rip her shoulders from their sockets. Her body was a plow, and the hard-pan earth was the field. Her boots, the good ones her father had bought her 2 Christmases ago, were long gone, lost somewhere in the first mile of this nightmare. Now it was just her bare feet, digging useless furrows in the dust, leaving little red trails in their wake. The horse was a monster, a big roan gelding with a mean eye and sweat-darkened flanks. Its hooves were thunder, kicking up clouds of grit that turned the air to sandpaper. She breathed it. She ate it. She tasted the iron of the dirt and the copper of her own blood. Her dress, the blue cotton one she'd been so proud of, the one that took 3 evenings by lamplight to stitch just right, it was gone, torn to ribbons against the rocks and thorns, a ghost of what it had been. But the pain wasn't the worst part, not even close. The worst part was the laughter. Behind her, 3 men rode easy on their mounts, following at a pace that was just fast enough to be agony. Their voices floated over the thunder of hooves, casual, like they were watching a dog chase a rabbit for sport. "Reckon she's learned her lesson yet, Marcus?" one of them called out, his voice thick with whiskey and satisfaction. "Not likely," came the reply from the man holding her rope. Marcus Brennan. His voice was gravel and cruelty. "Stubborn as her daddy was, but we got time. We got all the time in the world." Clara May Henderson had always been told she had too much fire. Her mother used to say it with a smile. Now, as the rope snapped taut and her shoulder slammed into a jutting stone, she wondered if that fire was finally about to burn her out for good. The desert stretched ahead, a dead sea of brown and gray, broken only by the skeletal arms of Joshua trees reaching for a sky that had long ago stopped listening. The sun was a merciless white hammer, beating down, turning the air to a shimmering haze. Every breath was like swallowing broken glass. She'd stopped screaming miles ago. There was no point. It only gave them the satisfaction. Her world had shrunk to a simple, brutal rhythm. Scrape, bounce, jolt. Scramble for a footing that was never there. The rope would go slack for a heartbeat, a cruel tease of hope, and then it would yank her forward again, stealing her breath, stealing her strength. This wasn't about getting somewhere. This was about breaking something, about teaching a lesson to the whole county. This is what happens to women who say no. This is what happens when you forget your place. She had said no 3 times. The first time, politely, when Jeremiah Stockton had come calling with his hat in his hands and poison on his lips. The second time, firmly, when he'd brought his father and a preacher to her door, a holy ambush meant to shame her into submission. The third time she'd said it with a shotgun. That had been a mistake. The rope jerked hard, and this time she couldn't roll with it. Her body hit the ground, shoulder first, and her vision exploded into a universe of white stars. When it cleared, the taste of blood was thick in her mouth. She didn't know if she'd bitten her tongue or her cheek. It didn't matter. Everything hurt too much to tell the difference anymore. Above her, a hawk circled, a lazy, patient spiral against the white-hot sky. She wondered if it could smell death coming. She wondered if her bones would be the next landmark in this forsaken stretch of nowhere, a final warning for other girls with too much fire. Then the horse slowed to a walk. The dragging stopped. For one blessed, beautiful moment, there was no jolting, no scraping. Clara lay in the dust, a broken doll, gasping for air. She tried to work feeling back into her hands. The rope had cut so deep she could see the glint of white bone through the blood at her left wrist. The sight should have made her sick, but she didn't look away. She had earned those wounds. "Ready to be reasonable yet?" Marcus called down from his saddle. His tone was almost friendly. Clara May turned her head, the grit scraping her cheek, and spat a thick glob of blood and dust onto the ground. "Go to hell!" The laughter came again, harder this time. "Hear that, boys? Still got some fight in her." That was Tommy Brennan, Marcus's younger brother. Barely a man, but he'd learned the cruelty of one well enough. "Won't last long in this heat," said a third voice. A man she didn't know. Cold, quiet, dangerous. Maybe we should find some shade, Tommy suggested. Let her think it over. No shade out here, Marcus replied, his voice flat. But that's all right. Jeremiah don't need a pretty bride, just a live one. Those words hit her harder than any rock, because they were true. Jeremiah Stockton didn't care if she came to him broken. He'd paid for her. Her father's gambling debts had turned her from a daughter into a commodity, a piece of property to be collected. The third man spoke up, his voice like the scrape of a boot on stone. Boss is getting impatient. He wants this settled before Sunday. 3 days. She had 3 days before they dragged her in front of a preacher and forced her to say vows that would make her suffering legal. 3 days until Jeremiah Stockton owned her, body and soul. The horse started moving again. The rope tightened. This time Clara May didn't fight it. She went limp, letting herself be dragged, saving what little strength she had left. The world blurred into a haze of pain and dust and sun. They could break her bones. They could tear her flesh. They could leave her for the buzzards. But they couldn't make her say yes. They couldn't extinguish the fire her mother had lit inside her. It was the only thing left in the world that was truly hers. The rope snapped taut, pulling her into another mile of hell. But Clara May Henderson held on to that fire like a prayer. Behind her the men rode on, patient as death. They had time, they had rope, and they had a woman who'd forgotten her place. What they didn't have was any idea that 20 miles ahead, a different kind of man was riding their way. A man who'd heard the sound of suffering on the wind. But Clara May didn't know that. All she knew was the rope. And then she noticed something. Something impossible. The rope, where it dug into her left wrist, wasn't just frayed from the strain. She could see the fibers, sliced clean, as if by a knife. It was subtle, almost invisible under the blood and grime. It looked like someone had started to cut it. But who? And why would they stop? The questions burned in her mind. A new kind of fire, hotter and more confusing than the pain. Was one of her captors having second thoughts? Or was this part of an even crueler game she couldn't yet understand? The horse thundered on, dragging her toward an answer she was terrified to find. 3 months earlier, she'd stood on the main street of Copper Ridge and watched her father stumble out of the saloon with blood on his knuckles and shame in his eyes. She'd known then that something was broken, but she never imagined how deep the rot went. William Henderson used to be a good man. He'd built their ranch from nothing, taught her to read from the Bible, and told her stories of the stars. But the desert grinds you down, and the whiskey and the cards at McGillicuddy's saloon grind you down faster. Clara May was different. While other girls learned to needlepoint, she learned to mend fences. While they practiced piano, she read her mother's old law books by lamplight, dreaming of a world bigger than this sun-scorched valley. Her mother, Sarah, had been a school teacher. She'd taught Clara that a woman's mind was a weapon, sharper than any man's when honed. But a fever took Sarah when Clara was 16, and with her went the heart of their family. William started to drift. A drink became a bottle. A game of cards became a mountain of debt. The ranch crumbled, fence by fence. Clara tried to hold it all together, but she was one woman against the tide, and the vultures were circling. The day Jeremiah Stockton came calling, she thought it was about business. Stockton wasn't a man who courted women. He acquired them. He was 53 with soft hands and a hard heart. His first wife had died in childbirth. His second had been found at the bottom of a canyon. The sheriff called it an accident. The sheriff also owed Stockton money. He sat in their parlor like he already owned it and laid out his terms with the cold precision of a butcher. Your father owes me $8,000, he'd said. Money borrowed against this ranch. The debt is due. He doesn't have it. Clara had felt the floor drop out from under her. However, Stockton continued, a smile touching his lips that didn't reach his eyes, I am prepared to offer him a partnership, a chance to not only clear his debt, but to become one of the most powerful men in the territory alongside me. Her father's eyes lit up with a desperate hope. A partnership? It sounded too good to be true. What's the catch? Clara had asked, her voice sharp. Stockton's gaze shifted to her. The partnership is sealed with a marriage. Your hand, in exchange for your family's salvation. She'd almost laughed. But then she saw her father's face, pleading, broken, and then came the first twist of the knife. "You see, Miss Henderson," Stockton said softly, "I already own the water rights to this entire valley. I bought them 6 months ago. Without my water, this ranch is just a patch of dirt and rock. It's worthless. Your father's been ranching on borrowed time. The trap wasn't just the debt. It was everything. They were surrounded. Her father had been a fool, gambling away not just his money, but their very survival. So the partnership is a cage," Clara had said, her voice shaking with rage. "A very comfortable cage," Stockton corrected. "My wife will want for nothing." "My answer is no." That was the first time. He simply smiled. "I admire your fire, Miss Henderson, but it will not keep you warm when the winter snows come to a barren ranch." The second time he came back with reinforcements. The preacher, his face sweating with unease, and Judge Morrison, the highest legal authority in the region. Marcus Brennan stood by the door, a silent threat. They didn't just try to persuade her, they tried to break her. Judge Morrison produced a legal document. "This is a writ of conservatorship," he explained, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Given your father's financial indiscretions and your own reckless refusal of a life-saving proposal, the court has seen fit to declare him incompetent. Mr. Stockton has graciously offered to act as his legal guardian, and by extension, yours." It was a legal ambush. They were trying to make her a ward of the state, with Stockton as her master. Her father, drowning in shame and whiskey, just sat there, head in his hands. But they had underestimated her. They didn't know about the nights she'd spent with her mother's law books. "A writ of conservatorship requires a physician's testimony of incompetence, Your Honor," Clara said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. "And it must be filed with the territorial clerk at least 30 days prior to enactment. I checked the record in Phoenix last week. There is no such filing." The color drained from Judge Morrison's face. The preacher looked like he might faint. She had called their bluff, using their own laws against them. She had humiliated them. Stockton's eyes went cold as a winter night. The polite facade was gone. "A clever little law bird," he hissed. "But even birds can have their wings clipped." That was the second no, and it signed her death warrant. The third time was at dawn. No polite talk, no legal tricks, just brute force. Marcus, Tommy, and the cold-eyed stranger named Colt kicked in the barn door. Clara scrambled into the hayloft, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered the old Sharps rifle her father kept hidden there. Her hands shook as she loaded it. "Get out!" she screamed down at them. "Get off this land!" Marcus just laughed. "Girl, you even know how to use that thing?" She pulled the trigger. The kick nearly broke her shoulder, and the bullet went wide. But it sent a clear message. For a moment, they were stunned. Then Colt drew his pistol with the speed of a striking snake. She knew she was about to die, but Marcus stopped him. "No, not yet. The boss wants her alive." He looked up at her, a strange glint of respect in his eyes. "That was your third no, Miss Henderson, and your last." And then she saw the flicker of a match. They weren't coming up after her. They were going to burn her out. The smoke was thick, blinding. The flames licked at the dry hay. She was trapped. Coughing, choking, she knew she had to jump. As she prepared to leap down into their arms, the barn door flew open again. It was her father. "Stop!" he cried. "Take her! Just leave us the ranch!" The betrayal was a physical blow, sharper than any flame. He was trading her, his own daughter, for a patch of worthless dirt. She didn't jump. She launched herself out of the hayloft like an avenging angel, not at Stockton's men, but at her own father, knocking him to the ground before they could grab her. In that moment of chaos, of pure, screaming fury, they swarmed her. They tied her hands and threw her over a saddle. They left her father in the dirt next to his burning barn, a broken man who had sold his soul for nothing, and they dragged her away, into the desert, into hell. Now lying in the dust, the sun beating down on her, she stared at the strange, clean cut on the rope at her wrist. It wasn't a trick of her mind. It was real. Someone had tried to free her, and failed. Or maybe they hadn't failed yet. Maybe this was just the beginning. The thought sent a jolt through her, more powerful than any yank of the rope. She wasn't just a victim being dragged to her fate. She was a piece on a board, in a game she was only just beginning to see, and she was damned if she was going to be a pawn. Crack! The sound ripped across the desert, a thunderclap from a cloudless sky. It wasn't the sound of a whip. It was a gunshot. For a split second, nothing happened. Marcus Brennan and his men looked around, confused, scanning the distant, shimmering ridges. A stray hunter, maybe. Then a puff of dust kicked up just inches from the roan gelding's front hoof. The horse screamed, rearing violently, its eyes wild with terror. Marcus cursed, fighting to stay in the saddle as the animal bucked and spun. Crack! A second shot. This one wasn't a warning. Clara felt it before she saw it. The fiery serpent at her wrist went limp. The rope, the anchor of her agony, parted. The bullet had hit it dead center, shredding the braided leather, severing her connection to the horse. Her momentum carried her forward, tumbling head over heels in the dust. When she finally skidded to a stop, a raw, bloody mess, the world was filled with shouting and chaos. "Sniper! On the ridge!" Tommy Brennan shrieked, his voice cracking like a terrified boy's. "East side, behind the rocks!" Clara forced herself to roll over, blinking through a mask of blood and dirt. Her wrists were still bound together, but she was free. Free from the horse. The three men had scattered like quail. Marcus was crouched behind his terrified mount, his own rifle out, scanning the red sandstone boulders 200 yards away. Tommy was circling his horse, a panicked animal wanting to bolt. And Colt, the cold-eyed killer, he had simply vanished, melted into the landscape like a ghost. That was the most terrifying part. Another shot echoed, and this time she saw the muzzle flash from the rocks. Someone was up there, someone with a rifle and the kind of skill that bordered on supernatural. To sever a rope on a moving target. Who was this person? "Show yourself," Marcus bellowed. "This ain't your business, stranger." The response was another bullet, so close to Marcus's head it snatched his hat from his scalp and sent it tumbling through the sagebrush. He yelped and dove behind a rock, dragging his horse with him. A voice rolled down from the ridge. It was deep, steady, and carried an authority that could command armies. "Like hell it ain't my business," the voice called. "Turn around and ride back where you came from. And nobody else has to bleed today." "You don't know who you're messing with," Tommy screamed, his fear making him bold. "This woman belongs to Jeremiah Stockton. It's legal." A harsh, humorless laugh echoed from the rocks. "Funny kind of legal that requires ropes and dragging. Where I come from, we call that kidnapping. And Marcus Brennan, I heard you were working for Stockton. Never figured you for a man who'd drag a woman to death." Marcus froze. He knew that voice. Clara saw the flicker of recognition, of fear in his eyes. This wasn't a random stranger. This was personal. "Who are you?" Marcus yelled, his voice strained. There was a pause, then, from the rocks, a different voice shouted, a voice Clara recognized with a chill. It was Colt. He must have circled around. "Brennan, it's Jake Morrison, the man from Tucson. There's a $5,000 bounty on his head." The entire dynamic shifted. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a payday. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. They weren't just Stockton's thugs now. They were bounty hunters. "Ma'am," the voice of Jake Morrison called down to her, gentler now. "Can you hear me?" Clara tried to answer, but only a raw croak came out. She managed to lift her bound hands in a weak wave. "Good," the voice continued. "Now I need you to answer me loud and clear. Do you want to go with these men?" She found her voice fueled by a surge of desperate hope. "No." "Do you want me to stop them?" "Yes." A savage grin split her torn lips. This man, this Jake Morrison, whoever he was her only chance. "Well now," Jake's voice boomed across the flats, laced with dark amusement. "Sounds to me like the lady's made her choice. The $5,000 ain't worth dying for, boys. Right away." But Colt was a predator. A $5,000 bounty was a fortune, and he wasn't about to let it go. Clara heard a soft scrape of boot on stone. Off to her left, Colt was flanking him, using the standoff as cover to get a clear shot at his bounty. In another minute, her mysterious savior would be dead. She had to warn him. She tried to shout, but her throat was a wasteland of dust and pain. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything, any weapon. And then she saw it. Marcus's skinning knife. It had fallen from its sheath when he dived for cover. It lay glinting in the sun, 10 feet away. 10 feet that might as well have been 10 miles. She began to crawl. Agony ripped through her with every movement. Her raw knees left bloody trails in the dirt. Her bound hands made it almost impossible. But she fixed her eyes on the glint of steel and pulled herself forward, inch by painful inch. Behind her, she heard Marcus trying to reason with Jake. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. Stockton owns this territory. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Let him try," came the calm reply. "I've been hunted by better men." She reached the knife. With clumsy, bloody fingers, she worked it free from its sheath. The blade was heavy, sharp. She twisted her hands, pointing the blade at the ropes that bound her, and began to saw. The steel bit into her already wounded flesh, but she didn't care. In the rocks, she saw movement. Colt was in position. He was raising his rifle. The ropes parted with a snap. Blood and fire rushed back into her numb hands. She gripped the knife properly and staggered to her feet, swaying, her legs like jelly. Colt took aim. Clara threw the knife. She'd learned from her father years ago, flinging blades at fence posts. She was out of practice, shaking with exhaustion and pain, but she was close, and she was desperate. The heavy blade spun end over end, a flash of silver in the brutal sun. It struck Colt in the shoulder with a sickening thud. He screamed, a sound of pure rage and shock, and his rifle clattered onto the rocks. The scream gave away his position. Two shots rang out from the ridge in quick succession, chipping stone right where Colt's head had been. But he was already moving, rolling away, the knife still sticking out of his shoulder. He came up with a pistol in his left hand, firing wildly. The distraction was all Marcus and Tommy needed. They scrambled for their horses, spurring them into a frantic gallop, fleeing the kill zone. But Colt wasn't running. Wounded or not, he was still a hunter. And now his prey was her. He was moving through the rocks, pistol in hand, closing the distance. There was nowhere to run, nothing to fight with. She was exposed, helpless. And then he was there. Jake Morrison came down from the ridge, not like a man, but like an avalanche. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace over the treacherous terrain. He was tall, dressed in dark, practical clothes, a rifle held casually in one hand. He reached the desert floor just as Colt broke from the rocks. For a heartbeat, the two men faced each other across 30 yards of open ground. Colt fired first, his aim thrown off by his wounded shoulder. The stranger didn't even flinch. He brought his rifle up, smooth and unhurried. He aimed. He fired. The shot was perfect. Colt was lifted off his feet and slammed back into the dust. He lay still, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Silence returned to the desert. The stranger walked to Colt's body, kicked the pistol away, and then turned to her. She finally saw him clearly. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 45, with silver in his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard miles. His face was weathered and scarred, but his eyes were kind. Not soft, but kind. He stopped a few feet from her, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice the same one from the ridge. "Name's Jake Morrison. You hurt bad?" The words wouldn't come. The danger was over, and her body finally remembered the hell it had been put through. Her legs buckled. He moved in a blur, catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were strong, steady. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt safe. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." She looked up into his weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "Don't thank me yet, ma'am. Jeremiah Stockton's still out there. And getting you clear of him is going to be the hard part." He glanced back at the rocks where he'd been hidden, then back at her, a troubled look in his eyes. "Especially since the man who sent you to Stockton in the first place is my own brother." The world tilted on its axis. Judge Morrison, the man who had tried to legally chain her to Stockton, was Jake's brother. This rescue wasn't an act of random kindness. This was a family feud. and she was standing right in the middle of it. Jake's camp was a secret whispered into the stone, a hidden box canyon with towering red walls and a spring that bubbled up clear and cold. It felt like paradise. Clara sat by the water, soaking her torn feet, while Jake worked on her wounds. He was methodical, his hands gentle as he cleaned her wrists and bandaged her cuts. "You're lucky," he said, securing the last bandage. "Nothing's broken." "Lucky," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is that what you call this?" He sat back on his heels, his kind eyes studying her. "You're alive when you shouldn't be. That's as lucky as it gets in this territory." He moved to the small fire, the smell of coffee and bacon a welcome ghost from a life she thought she'd lost. "Besides," he added, not looking at her, "luck had nothing to do with that knife throw. That was skill. My father taught me," she said quietly, "a long time ago." The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. "Your brother," she finally said. "Judge Morrison." Jake's shoulders tensed. He poked the fire with a stick, watching the embers dance. "We haven't spoken in 10 years, he said, his voice low. "Not since he took his first bribe from Jeremiah Stockton." So it ran that deep. This wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a war. "Stockton bought him," Jake continued. "Bought him cheap. A judgeship, a bit of money. In return, my brother, the Honorable Judge Morrison, makes Stockton's legal troubles disappear, like the accidental death of his second wife." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The rumors were true. "I tried to expose them," Jake said, his voice laced with old bitterness. "Gathered evidence. Found a witness. The witness was found dead a week later. The evidence vanished from the sheriff's office, and I was run out of the territory with a trumped-up murder charge on my head." He looked at her then, the full weight of his history in his gaze. "The men I supposedly killed in Tucson? One of them was the sheriff who covered it all up. I wasn't trying to kill him. I was trying to arrest him. It went wrong. Good men died because I made a mistake." This man wasn't just an outlaw. He was a disgraced lawman, a ghost haunting his own past, trying to right a wrong that had cost him everything. "Why come back now?" she asked. "Why risk it for me?" "Because I heard Stockton was finally making his move," Jake said. "Not just for your ranch, but for the whole valley. I've been watching him for months, and because my brother's name was on the legal papers. I had to know how deep he'd sunk. When I saw them dragging you, I guess I decided I was done watching." He handed her a tin cup of coffee. It burned her fingers, but it felt good. "Stockton's power," Jake said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is built on a lie. The original territorial land grant that gives him claim to the water rights, it's a forgery, a brilliant one, but a fake." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. "A forgery? Are you sure?" "I'm sure. The real grant, the one that divides the water rights among the original settler families, including yours, is hidden somewhere in Copper Ridge. My father, the judge before my brother, he knew Stockton was a snake. He hid the real document before he died. If we can find it, we don't just save you. We break Stockton. We gut his entire empire." Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. "So we're going back," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake nodded slowly. "We're going back, but it's not going to be easy. Stockton will have every road, every pass, every watering hole watched. He's expecting you to run. He won't be expecting you to run straight back into the heart of his web." They rode out at dawn, two ghosts against a blood-red sky. The journey was a tense, silent crawl through a landscape that wanted them dead. Jake moved with the instincts of a predator, staying to the shadows, reading the signs in the dust. They saw patrols in the distance, puffs of dust that meant Stockton's men were sweeping the desert for them. By midday, they reached the rim of Devil's Canyon, a massive gash in the earth, and saw the trap. 3 riders waited at the bottom, guarding the only safe crossing. 2 were Stockton's men. The third wore a badge. "That's Deputy Miller," Jake said, looking through his spyglass. "He's the one who signed the warrant for my arrest. Loyal to Stockton, right down to his boots." Going around would take days they didn't have. They were pinned down. Clara scanned the canyon walls, her eyes tracing the lines in the rock. To the east, a recent rock slide had created a steep, treacherous slope of loose scree and gravel. It was a suicidal path. It was also the last thing the men below would be expecting. There, she said, pointing. We go down there. Jake looked at the slide, then back at her. A slow smile spread across his face. You've got more fire than I thought, Clara May. All right, your funeral. Let's do it. The descent was a controlled fall, a nightmare of sliding rock and panicked horses. Halfway down, a shot rang out from below. Deputy Miller had spotted them. A bullet grazed Clara's horse, and the animal screamed, losing its footing. It tumbled, pulling her with it. Jake threw himself in its path, trying to halt the slide. He saved the horse, but the impact sent him crashing into a jutting rock. He came up with his left arm hanging at a sickeningly wrong angle, his shoulder clearly dislocated. They scrambled the rest of the way down under fire, bullets whining off the rocks around them. They found cover in a narrow wash, their hearts hammering. Jake was pale, his face beaded with sweat from the pain. We have to set it, Clara said, her voice shaking. She'd read about this in her books, but reading and doing were two very different things. As she braced herself to put his shoulder back in place, they heard the sound of the posse getting closer, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. They had to be quick, and they had to be quiet. Do it, Jake gritted out, biting down on a piece of leather. She pulled. He didn't make a sound, but his whole body went rigid. It didn't work. The posse was almost upon them. Again, he gasped. She pulled again, harder this time, tears of effort and fear streaming down her face. There was a wet, sickening pop as the joints slid back into place. At that exact moment, the three riders thundered past the mouth of their hiding place, not even glancing in their direction. They were gone. They waited, hearts pounding in the sudden silence, until they were sure. They had made it, bruised, battered, and one of them badly injured. But they were through. That night, they found Stockton's main camp. It was a fortress of rock and firelight, with a dozen armed men. And in the center, tied to a post, was her father. He was beaten, slumped in defeat, but he was alive. Clara started to rise, a cry of rage on her lips, but Jake pulled her down, his good hand like a vice on her shoulder. It's bait, he whispered. He wants you to charge in. They watched for hours, hidden in the rocks. They saw Stockton approach her father, not with a whip, but with a pen and a piece of paper. He was forcing him to sign something. The deed, Clara breathed, the final piece for his forgery. Then they heard Stockton talking to Marcus Brennan. The wedding is at 10. Once she says her vows and the deed is signed, they're both loose ends. The father has an accident on the way to the debtor's prison. The girl, a tragic suicide, grieving for her father. The blood in Clara's veins turned to ice. This wasn't just about a wedding, it was an execution. Sunday morning was their deadline. For everything. The church, Jake whispered, his mind already working, piecing together a desperate, insane plan. He needs a public wedding to make it all look legitimate. That's his weakness. He needs the audience. So I'd give him one, Clara said, understanding dawning in her eyes. I walk right in, on my own terms. It's the only way, Jake confirmed. You create a diversion, the biggest one this territory has ever seen. You get every important eye in that church focused on you. While you're doing that, I'm not on a ridge. I'm going into Stockton's office. It's right next to the church. I'm getting those documents. It was a suicide mission, a two-front war against an army. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the desert, they looked at each other. There was no fear left, only a cold, hard resolve. Ready? Jake asked. Clara checked the pistol he'd given her. She thought of her mother, of the law books, of the fire that refused to be put out. Ready, she said. The bell of St. Matthew's began to toll, calling the good people of Copper Ridge to witness a wedding or a war. The walk down Main Street was the longest of her life. People stared from behind curtains, from the doorways of shops. Their faces were a cocktail of fear, pity, and a morbid curiosity. Clara May ignored them. She walked with her head high, the dust of the desert still on her borrowed clothes. the bruises on her face a testament to her journey. She looked like what she was, a ghost who had come back to haunt her own funeral. She had cleaned up, braided her hair, but there was no hiding the rope burns on her wrists, the raw scrapes on her cheek. She didn't want to hide them. Let them see. Let them all see what Jeremiah Stockton called marriage. The church was packed. The front pews were filled with territorial officials, the politicians and ranchers who fed from Stockton's hand. In the back, the common folk were crammed together, eager for the spectacle. Stockton stood at the altar, a black-suited spider in the center of his web. Beside him, Pastor Mackenzie looked pale enough to shatter. When Stockton saw her walk through the door, alone and unbroken, his eyes widened for a fraction of a second. It was the only genuine surprise she had ever seen on his face. The whispers in the church died as she walked down the aisle. The only sound was the soft scuff of her boots on the wooden floor. Each step was a drumbeat, counting down to the explosion. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to smell his expensive cologne. "Miss Henderson," Stockton said, his voice booming with false charm. "How unexpected. I was told you'd met with a tragic end." He was already spinning his story, painting himself as the grieving groom. "Your men were mistaken, Mr. Stockton," she said, her voice clear and steady. "As you can see, I'm very much alive." She turned to face the congregation, her eyes sweeping over the crowd until they landed on Judge Morrison, sitting in the front row. Jake's brother, her tormentor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing with a power that silenced every corner of the church. "Thank you for coming. It's not every day you get to witness a crime in progress." A gasp rippled through the pews. "Clara May," the pastor stammered, "perhaps we should—" "Oh, we will proceed, Pastor," she cut him off. "But let's be clear about what we are proceeding with. This is not a marriage. This is the settlement of a debt. A debt my father was tricked into for a ranch made worthless by this man who stole our water rights." She pointed a finger at Stockton. The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably. "I refused his offer," she continued, her voice rising, "3 times. And for that refusal, his men burned down my barn, beat my father, and dragged me behind a horse for 20 miles of desert." She held up her wrist, showing the raw, scarred flesh. "This is my engagement ring, Mr. Stockton. These are the vows you wish me to take?" Judge Morrison rose to his feet, his face a mask of judicial outrage. "Miss Henderson, these are outrageous accusations." "Are they, Your Honor?" Clara locked eyes with him, the man who had tried to sign her life away. "You sat in my parlor. You told me the law was clear. Was this the law you meant, Judge Morrison? The law of the rope and the hired gun? The law written in Jeremiah Stockton's ledger?" The judge flinched as if she'd slapped him. "Where's your father?" he demanded, trying to regain control. "He is a prisoner," she cried, "held hostage by Stockton's men to ensure I would walk down this aisle and legitimize this man's crimes before all of you." The church erupted. People were on their feet, shouting. The sheriff had his hand on his gun, his face a mess of confusion and fear. Stockton had heard enough. The calm facade shattered. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice cut through the noise like a whip. "I will not be slandered." And then the trap sprang. From all corners of the church, men stood up. Wedding guests who were not wedding guests. Hired guns, a dozen of them, pistols appearing in their hands as if from thin air. The shouting stopped. A cold, terrifying silence fell over the church. "You see," Stockton said, his voice now dangerously quiet, "I took precautions. The wedding will proceed." He reached into the front pew and grabbed a little girl, the daughter of a town official, yanking her out and pressing the muzzle of his pistol to her temple. The girl's mother screamed. "Now!" Stockton hissed, his eyes blazing with triumph. "Pastor, the vows!" Pastor Mackenzie was trembling so badly he could barely stand. "Clara May Henderson," he began, his voice a choked whisper. "Do you take—" This was it, the moment she would trade her soul to save a child. She opened her mouth to say yes. Crack. The sound came from the church balcony. Not a pistol, but a rifle. A single, perfect shot. The gunman closest to the terrified child dropped, a neat hole in his forehead. Jake. All hell broke loose. Two more shots rang out from the sides of the church. Two townsmen, honorable men Jake had recruited, opened fire. The church became a slaughterhouse. People screamed, diving behind pews. Gunfire thundered, splintering the wood, shattering the stained glass windows. Stockton's men were caught in a crossfire. Clara threw herself behind the communion rail as bullets chewed up the wood above her head. She saw Stockton, his face a mask of pure rage, aiming his pistol not at her, but at Judge Morrison. He was eliminating his loose ends. "You want a war?" Stockton snarled. "You'll get one." Before he could pull the trigger, Clara's pistol was in her hand. The hours of practice, her mother's lessons, her own fire, it all came together in one fluid motion. She fired from her knees. The bullet caught Stockton's center mass. He staggered, a look of stunned surprise on his face. His own shot went wild, blasting a hole in the wall. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, and then back at her. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a kind of grudging respect. "My office," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. "The safe, it's all—" He collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. The gunfight was over in 2 minutes. The surviving gunmen threw down their weapons. Clara didn't wait. She didn't look at the carnage. She remembered Stockton's last words. The office. The safe. She ran from the church, ignoring the shouts, and burst into Stockton's office. The huge iron safe stood against the wall. She had no idea how to open it. Jake appeared at her side, his rifle still smoking. "The combination," he said, his face grim. "Try the date my brother first took office." He spun the dial. The heavy door swung open. It was all there. The forged land grant, the deed to her father's ranch signed under duress, and underneath it all, a leather-bound ledger. Clara opened it. Page after page of meticulous handwriting detailed every bribe, every blackmail, every crime Stockton had ever committed. It named names: the sheriff, the deputy, half the officials in the territory. And on the very first page, a payment of $500 to a newly appointed circuit judge, his brother. Jake took the ledger from her hands, his face like stone. This wasn't just proof. It was a bomb, ready to blow their corrupt world wide open. They walked back into the silent, smoking church. Jake held up the ledger. "It's over," he said, his voice echoing in the ruined sanctuary. "The lies are over." He walked down the aisle and dropped the book at his brother's feet. Judge Morrison stared at it, his face ashen. He had been exposed. His world had ended. Sheriff Caldwell, seeing the tide had turned for good, finally did his duty. He placed the judge under arrest. Clara ran past them all, out the door, and toward the canyon where her father was being held. The nightmare was over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. 6 months later, Clara May Henderson stood in the doorway of something impossible: the Henderson School for Young Women. It had been built with money seized from Stockton's illegal empire, a monument of justice rising from the ashes of corruption. The town of Copper Ridge was transformed. Judge Morrison was in a federal prison. The ledger had cleaned house, sweeping out the corrupt officials and replacing them with honest men. Her father, his debts cleared and his honor restored, was now the head of the new town council. And Jake Morrison, the outlaw, had been pardoned. After much persuasion from Clara, he had accepted the badge of a territorial marshal. He was no longer a ghost haunting the territory. He was its sworn protector. Her students, daughters of ranchers and shopkeepers, were learning not just reading and writing, but constitutional law. They were learning about their rights. They were learning to have a voice. The ripple effect of that bloody Sunday had spread far beyond Copper Ridge. The story of the wedding war had become a legend. Clara had become a symbol. But legends attract attention, both good and bad. A telegram arrived one afternoon. It was from the sheriff in Tombstone. "Marcus Brennan," Jake said, his face grim as he read it. "He's been talking, hired some gunfighters. He's talking about unfinished business." Clara felt a chill, but not fear. "Let him come," William Henderson said, his voice hard. "This isn't the same town he left." He was right. When Brennan and his 6 hired killers rode into Copper Ridge in the dead of night, they weren't met by a sleeping, frightened town. They were met by a prepared one. The citizens had organized. Jake had trained them. The gunfight wasn't in a church this time. It was in the streets. A battle for the soul of their community. It was short, brutal, and decisive. When the sun rose, Marcus Brennan was dead, and Copper Ridge had proven it would not be cowed by the ghosts of the past. The victory cemented their legacy. It also brought the nation's attention crashing down on them. Clara and Jake were married 6 months later in the rebuilt St. Matthew's Church. Their marriage was a statement. She became Clara Mae Henderson Morrison, keeping her name, her identity. Their marriage contract, guaranteeing her rights to property and career, was published in newspapers from San Francisco to New York. It became a template for a new kind of partnership, one based on equality, not ownership. She was no longer just a rancher's daughter. She was a leader, a revolutionary. 3 years after she killed Jeremiah Stockton, Clara Mae Henderson Morrison stood before the United States Congress in Washington, D.C. The marble halls were packed. The nation was listening. "Honorable members," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I stand before you not as a victim, but as a survivor. I am here to speak for the thousands of women who have been treated as property, whose lives have been bartered to settle the debts of men." In the gallery, Jake watched, his federal marshal's uniform crisp, his eyes filled with a pride that was almost overwhelming. Her father sat beside him, tears streaming down his weathered face. Behind them sat some of her first students, now young women in their own right, attending universities, starting businesses, changing the world. She told her story. She told the stories of hundreds of other women she had collected. She presented the case for a new federal law, the Henderson Act. It would make debt-based marriage illegal. It would guarantee married women's property rights. It would make domestic violence a federal crime. The 14th Amendment promises equal protection, she declared, her voice rising with a passion that captivated the chamber. But that promise is a lie as long as half our population can be bought and sold. I was dragged behind a horse because I believed I had the right to choose my own path. I stand here today to demand that you grant that right to every woman in this nation. The debate was fierce. The opposition was powerful. But her story, their story, was more powerful. When the final vote was called, the Henderson Act passed by a margin of 12 votes. It was a start. That night at a reception, a young woman with calloused hands and tired eyes approached her. "Miss Morrison," she said, her voice trembling, "I came all the way from my family's farm in Nebraska. My father is trying to marry me off to settle a business deal. After hearing you, I think I'm going to fight him." Clara took the young woman's hands. "What's your name?" "Rebecca." "Rebecca," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "Fighting doesn't always mean guns. Sometimes it means using the law. Sometimes it just means refusing to accept what they tell you is inevitable. Your life belongs to you." She handed her a card for the legal clinic she had established back in Arizona, run by her first-star pupil, Elizabeth Patterson, now the territory's first female lawyer. "Every woman who stands up for herself," Clara said, "makes it easier for the next one. We're not strangers. We're sisters in the same fight." Later, as she and Jake walked through the gaslit streets of Washington, she looked up at the illuminated dome of the Capitol building. "My mother used to say," she murmured, "that every generation has to choose. Make the world better, or just accept it as it is." "She'd be proud of you, Clara," Jake said quietly. "She's not the only one." The fight was far from over. There would be more Rebeccas to help, more corrupt men to challenge, more laws to change. But tonight they had won. The little girl who learned to read law books by lamplight had become a woman who wrote laws for the nation. The rope that was meant to break her had been transformed, its fibers woven into a new story for America. A story of courage, a story of justice, a story that was still just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, you're not going to believe the two I've got queued up for you on the screen right now. They're some of the most shocking and inspiring tales I've ever come across. Go ahead and click on one to keep the adventure going. And if you haven't already, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.